Hello, and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers, and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. My guest today is Poppy G, a Brisbane-based author who was born and raised in Tasmania. Her brand new novel, Vanishing Falls, was recently released in Australia by Booktopia Editions. It's a gripping, atmospheric thriller set in a fictional town in the Tasmanian rainforest. A pacey read full of colourful, wildly different characters who don't behave in the way you expect them to. Regular listeners will know that I'm a crime junkie and for that reason thoroughly enjoyed reading this wonderful novel. And I'm delighted to welcome Poppy to the podcast today. Hi, Poppy.
Hello, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me.
Congratulations on the release of Vanishing Falls. How are you feeling about its release into the world?
Well, it was released in August in the US, and so it's only been released just this week in Australia. So I should say I'm completely excited and thrilled, but you know, the truth is it's very underlyingly nerve-wracking. So it's a mixed feeling. I'm very proud of the book. Very excited that finally I can show it to everyone. But yeah, it's a little bit scary as well as your friends and family start to read it.
I can only imagine that feeling. Yeah, when we started communicating about this interview, the book had already been released in the US, as you just mentioned, and now it's out in Australia. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came about? Why was it released in the US first?
So my journey to writing, like many people, it was a very long journey, and I'd written 5 unpublished manuscripts. I'd been rejected from the Vogel Australian Award for Unpublished Manuscripts about 5 times, which I've still got all those rejection letters. And then I realised that a lot of the authors who I admired here in Australia had done a master's in creative writing. So I did that in about 2011. And the novel that I wrote through that creative writing program at the University of Queensland, I finished it. And in about December of that year, one evening here at home, I typed literary agent New York into Google, just sort of as a bit of light-hearted way to spend the evening. And I looked through all the different websites and I found a website that I thought looked pretty. And then I found an agent who some of the books that she represented I thought sounded similar to mine. So I wrote her quite a personal cover letter, sort of explaining why my novel was similar to ones that she already represented. And she replied to me immediately and asked to see the novel. And by the end of January, she had offered her representation. And so that's how I sort of have that New York connection for my writing. So Julia Kenny is the name of the agent, and I still work with her. When this second novel, when she was sending it out, all her contacts are in the US. So she sent it to the New York publishers in the first instance. So that's why it was published by HarperCollins in New York, as opposed to here.
What's the feedback that you're getting from US readers?
Well, the funny thing from the US readers is they say that Tasmania sounds exotic, which makes me laugh because I grew up there. And when I was growing up there, I'm 43 now, but when I was a kid, it was not exotic. You know, you could barely get a cup of coffee. It was sort of daggy. I can remember when Sizzler and McDonald's came when I was in high school, was the highlight of the culinary year. The Americans think it sounds like this very exotic place. I suppose it's so far away. I've done quite a few interviews and podcasts with American people, and I said, why did you pick my book to cover? And they all said, oh, Tasmania just sounds so exotic and exciting.
Right, well, there you go.
No.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, many people in Australia would now be familiar with Booktopia, one of our largest online book retailers, but not many people would know that they also have a publishing arm. So I wanted to ask you, what does this mean for distribution of your book? Does it mean that it'll be available in the traditional bricks and mortar stores or only online?
Yes, both. So Booktopia Editions is a wing of Booktopia that we've all heard of, and it's a new division that they began at the end of last year. I believe they have published about 20 books so far across all genres. And so they are trying to work with the booksellers and the bookshops and have their books in all bookstores. So my book is available in many bookstores, but not all. I think the bookstores need to create an account with Booktopia, and that's how they can order, as they do with traditional publishing houses. It's kind of exciting. I'm really pleased to be working with them, and they've been so lovely, and it's it's at the fledgling stage. It's kind of nice to be working with Booktopia Editions this year while it's in the very first year of what they're trying to do.
So moving to the story itself, Poppy, this is essentially a murder mystery set in a small town in the rainforests of northwestern Tasmania. Is that right?
In the book, I was a bit vague about where it's located, but in my mind, it is a village somewhere between Mole Creek, Westbury and Cradle Mountain. So that's sort of that northern central area, which is not far from Launceston, where I grew up.
What was the seed of inspiration that got you started writing this story?
I'm very passionate about Tasmania. I love it. I think it's such a beautiful place, and I love it because it's a place of contrast. There's the gorgeous forests and the beautiful ice and sugar white beaches, and there's tiny little historical villages dotted throughout the island. But at the same time, it's a land of contrast. So the forests are quite dangerous. You have to be very careful not to accidentally wander off the hiking trail. The beaches, I think there's only 2 patrolled beaches in Tasmania. The rest of them are unpatrolled, usually uninhabited. So it's quite, as well as being beautiful, it's quite dangerous. And I just like that contrast between the darkness of Tasmania and then its absolute exquisite natural beauty. For me, the landscape is as much a character as any of my characters. So I think that's one part. And I'm very interested in Tasmanian history. There is a little bit of history weaved through the novel, a slender thread, I would say. I have to hold myself back a little bit so it's not too heavy on the history. But yeah, Tasmania has a lot to offer.
So for those who haven't read it, can you tell me a little bit more about the story?
Vanishing Falls is set in a fictional village deep in the Tasmanian rainforest. And on a dark, stormy night, the wealthiest woman in town disappears from her historic mansion. As the village people try to piece together what happens to Celia, they ask questions. And first of all, they're not sure what's happened. They think, has she just run away? Has she been kidnapped? Has she been murdered? And as they examine what happened to her, it turns out that many of the people in the village have their own deep, dark secrets that they are trying to keep hidden. And sort of as tensions heighten, these secrets slowly are revealed. And it's a situation where when one secret is sort of unraveled, it's like tugging on a thread. All the secrets slowly begin to unravel together. And the most important character for me is the character of Joelle. Everyone in the village knows that her brain works a bit differently from other people's. She's this most beautiful, joyful, exuberant, lovely woman. She's mother of 2 and she's a hairdresser and she works in her husband's butchery. But she might not be who everyone thinks she is. And she takes it upon herself to solve the mystery of what happened to Celia Lilly. But there is a moral dilemma for this character because in doing so, she has to decide whether to risk revealing her past, which could compromise this beautiful life that she's created for herself.
I really loved Joelle, and she's a tragic character in so many ways. Was she inspired by a real life person?
There was a lady in our family who was similar to Joelle, but the real inspiration for her came from a newspaper story that I read years ago. And it was about a horrific crime some young men had committed. And there was a young girl present who inadvertently witnessed the crime. And after the men were all sent away to jail forever, and the young girl who was vulnerable, she'd come from a background where she didn't have a lot of family support. She has just vanished. She created a different life for herself somewhere else. And so I was just always thinking about this young girl. And I think the very first tiny spark for this story, Vanishing Falls, was to write a happy ending for this character. So someone who has been involved in something sort of accidentally, and how do they recover from that? I definitely wanted it to be a happy ending. So Joelle gets this beautiful happy ending, but of course it's a murder mystery. So the the happy ending gets derailed for some time.
And as you've alluded to, she had a trauma in her past, and I think it's fair to say that she has some PTSD in relation to that trauma.
Yes.
And just reading about Joelle, her PTSD felt so real. So I wanted to know, how did you get inside her head?
Oh, that's a good question. How did I get inside Joelle's head? I mean, with all the characters, I imagine I am the character. So, it's funny, they sometimes say writing is acting for the introvert. And I think that's kind of true in a way. I sort of, with all the characters, even the most awful ones, I sort of think, what would I be doing if I was that person? How would I react to that situation? And for Joelle, I loved writing Joelle because Joelle says the first thing that pops into her head. So I'd be writing away and I would start the scene. Often, when you're writing, you sort of describe how the character's feeling. I thought, no, she just says it. So that was quite fun. It was sort of refreshing to write a character that is less guarded than most characters. As for the actual trauma, what I was trying to achieve with Joelle was to show the power of kindness and community. If people can all sort of rally around, there's different points in our lives when some people need a bit more help than others. And I just wanted to show that how once Joelle could get back on her feet, it was through acts of kindness that people could give to her to help her to then become sort of this independent young woman.
So the story is told from multiple points of view, and each point of view grounds us in a different location at different times throughout the story. Why did you choose to include those other points of view?
There's 3 points of view. I'll start with Jack. So Jack is the wealthy landowner whose wife goes missing. He is a man who has absolutely everything, yet he still wants something more. So that is probably where I came from, that perspective. I'm very organic when I'm writing. I didn't plot the novel out. It's sort of all these ideas come together and then I write them. And then at the end, it's really hard. I have to go back through and make sure that the plot actually functions. And I almost find that's like the scientific side of it. So I had this idea about this man who has everything, a beautiful wife, a beautiful farm, and gorgeous children, yet he's seeking something more unsavory. And so I was intrigued about that sort of element. We do see that in people that we know. I'm sure everyone can think of someone that they know who looks like they've got the perfect life, but it's not quite enough to satisfy them. They're not happy with it. So that was sort of where I was coming from with Jack. And then with Cliff, they're friends. So Cliff is a poor, hardworking chicken farmer. I think he does feel a bit sorry for himself, but he's also makes his own bed in many ways. You have these people in Tasmania and, they've inherited the family business and they're trying to get ahead, but it can just be so hard. And then I was looking at the contrast between Cliff and Jack's relationship and why these two are friends. How can you have sort of these two very different men and what brings them together? Because friendship is something that I explore in the novel that sort of drive some of the action.
Yes, I wanted to pick up a little bit about the themes, particularly of this theme of addiction in the novel. I mean, suffice it to say that there's a strong criminal underbelly in Vanishing Falls. You paint a picture of a town in the grip of a crystal meth or methamphetamine addiction. And as you said, between Cliff and Jack, there's a stark divide between the haves and the have-nots. And the gloominess of the weather contributes to the feeling of hopelessness and misery. So I wanted to ask, was this something you consciously wanted to explore? And why?
Yes. Sadly, the methamphetamine epidemic is a reality of many small towns and cities. And I think everyone who's listening can probably think of someone or a family who has been affected by it. And it affects all walks of life. But particularly in a small town where everybody knows each other, I feel like the damage can be more intense. And so I'm not so much interested in the addict as I was quite interested in how that affects the people around them. There are victims of the addiction who don't touch the drug themselves. I was interested in exploring that. Tasmania is tiny. It's also it performs very low on every sort of major indicator, from health to salary, across the board. Its socio-economic potential is quite low compared to the rest of the states in Australia. Consequently, when a cheap drug like methamphetamine is presented down there, it's become quite available. And I was intrigued by how that does affect certain people. I've seen people come to it. I've also seen people that have managed to survive it.
Now, you said that it wasn't something that you wanted to explore purely from the addict's point of view, but I have to say your description of what addiction looks and feels like was eye-opening. So tell me how or what research you did to be able to bring this to the page.
Yeah, I did do some research because personally I have no experience, and nor does my family. I do have a friend who is a survivor, so he was very helpful to me. It's a difficult one to talk about, and there's such a stigma with drug addiction, but it's extremely fascinating. And so everything that you read in the book is based on a very real experience of that drug. So I didn't just make anything up. It's something that I had learned about through my friend.
The showpiece for the town of Vanishing Falls is Calendar House, the home of Jack Lilly and his wife Celia. Now, this is an opulent home by most people's standards: 52 rooms, 12 hallways, 7 staircases spread across 4 floors, and 365 windows. Was this house based on a real one?
Yes, so people do ask me that, and people are surprised when I say yes, it actually is. So there is a very real Calendar House in Tasmania, down near Richmond, which is in sort of between Hobart and Launceston, and it is called Mona Vale, and it's a private residence. I'd heard about these calendar houses. I don't think there's too many in the world, but obviously they're something that was built by people who had a lot of money in the 1830s, and it's obviously something you would do to show everyone, so everyone that's riding past on their horse and cart can tell that you do have a lot of money. I placed it up near my fictional town. Where I've set the novel is inspired a little bit by Tasmanians will know this place, a place called Old Wesleydale, which is another gorgeous historic estate. It operates as a luxury bed and breakfast at the moment, and it's got beautiful gardens. They've got walls around the garden, and they've got a fortified barn, which was to protect their grain and their food from bushrangers and presumably attacks by Indigenous people. But you can still go and see that today. So I've sort of made this amalgam of the Calendar House and the old Wesleydale estate and placed it somewhere sort of near Mole Creek.
Poppy, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I love it when I can learn something about the history of this country when reading for pleasure. And growing up, I always knew Tasmania as the Apple Isle. I remember a friend bringing me a souvenir of a wooden apple figure back from a visit when I was in high school. So I was surprised to learn that the industry suffered a decline and that the Tasmanian government sponsored what was called a tree pulling program. So can you tell me what that was all about?
Apples were huge in Tasmania, and I've read the most beautiful descriptions of these rolling hills of gorgeous apple trees. But then the government ordered all of the Australian apples to be pulled out, and people did so because I think the apple price decreased catastrophically because people were getting cheaper apples elsewhere, and so the people did pull the apples out. They're not all of them, you can still see some, but it decimated the industry, which is a real shame. For people who are interested travelling around Tasmania now that the borders have opened up, the Huon Valley down near Hobart, that you can still see a lot of the infrastructure from the apple growing industry. And I think that sort of there's like the apple sheds where they were loading them have turned into like nice little bistros or bars or cheese tasting places. So the history of it is still there to be seen, even though they're not growing apples in as much abundance as they used to.
You mentioned that, there is an historical thread that goes throughout this book. So what other research did you have to do in the course of writing this book?
I love research. I love history. But for me, it's an absolute rabbit hole. Once I go down, I could spend days researching things that aren't even that very, very helpful to the novel. But one of the things that I really enjoyed researching for this novel was the history or the mystery really of John Glover. And he was a Englishman who moved to Tasmania in the 1830s, and he lived not far from Launceston, and he painted beautiful landscapes. What I found very interesting about his work, the art critics used to believe that John Glover was painting pictures of Tasmania to make it look like England, because he would paint these pastoral scenes where there weren't many trees. It was sort of like a cleared area, and the animals were grazing, and there were Indigenous people going about their business. That was always presumed that he had been homesick for England, and he was painting Tasmania to look like England. And then in recent years, art critics change how they interpret that, and it's in line with historians now understand that the Indigenous people were in fact clearing the land, farming the land. And so these sort of little meadows that were there were actually there. They were created by the Indigenous people so they could encourage the kangaroos to come down and graze in the pasture, and it made it easier for them to harvest the animals. And so I find that interesting, how we think of our history and how we reinterpret history over time as we change our understanding of what happened. I found that really fascinating. And so that ties into my mystery plot, because in 1835, John Glover sent something like 68 paintings to England to be exhibited at the London exhibition, to be exhibited and sold. And following that exhibition, all but 5 of these paintings disappeared. And as you probably know, wealthy people who buy paintings always used to keep a list of, like, it was recorded who bought which painting and who owned which painting. So art historians have been unable to trace what happened to the majority of these paintings. It's not clear whether they were sold or were they lost at sea. It could be likely. But occasionally one of these paintings will turn up in Australia or America, and they're worth a lot. They're probably worth about $500,000. I guess I wanted to tie that in to the novel so that, you know, a painting is discovered. Jack discovers it on a colleague's property, and that question of ownership, of who owns this painting. And so that becomes part of it. You know, the question is that a motive for murder? Is that why Celia Lilly has disappeared?
Did you always want to be a writer?
Yes, forever and ever. I've written in a diary since I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And once I got to university, I stopped writing in the diary and I just began writing novels, just for the fun of it. I just love it. When I'm writing, I just feel happy. I just love it. I think I would be writing whether I was published or not. I find it very therapeutic, very calming. And like, my husband likes exercising. He rides a bike and goes jogging. And I think it's similar. If he doesn't exercise each day, he doesn't feel quite right. And I feel a bit the same with writing.
What advice do you have for other writers out there looking to get published?
Yes, it's a good question. And I like that you ask this of all your writers on the podcast. And everyone says something different.
They sure do.
They do. And sometimes, you know, they even conflict with what each other says. So I think it's really important for writers to choose their own path. But I think the one piece of advice that everyone says is to write, to read, to persevere, repeat.
Mm-hmm.
I think on a practical level, it's a good idea to write the blurb of your novel and write it, you know, as you start, and then maybe rewrite it 10 times as you're going through the drafting process. Because if you want to be a commercial writer and you want your novel to sell, that's a really important part of it. And for example, for Vanishing Falls, and the publishing house in New York wrote one blurb that went on the back, and it was just okay. And then they redrafted it, and what they wrote, what's there today, which I think is really great. And it just shows the difference between a good blurb on the back and an okay blurb. But if you could sort of write, if you had your blurb to start with, it would help you focus on what your novel is about. The other thing, I don't think someone who wants to write needs advice, because I think we do it because it's a compulsive thing that we wish to do. So I was listening on the radio the other day to Jana Pittman, who is a runner, I think. She's an athlete.
Mm.
She's retired from her athletic career, but she is now a doctor. But she said something that resonated with me. And she said one of the reasons she's made such a successful transition from being a professional athlete into her next stage of life is because she allowed herself to grieve her failures. And she said she's an emotional person, and so each time something didn't work out for her how she hoped it would, she let herself be sad about that. I think that's really important as a writer, whether it's a rejection or a bad review. I think it's okay to feel sad, and you should let yourself do that so then you can move on to the next thing. At the same time, I really would urge writers to celebrate your milestones, and that could be a rejection letter from the Vogel, because I think that's a milestone, the fact that you wrote a manuscript that you were able to submit. And the same, whether it's finishing a draft or entering a short story in a competition, attending a writers group for a year, whatever these are, I think it's such a long journey, and you really are doing it for yourself. And if you can find ways to celebrate along the way, I think that would make it a more joyful process than if you wait for some sort of vague notion of what success might be, because that's something that is so unknown, what will happen at the end of your novel. Yeah, allow yourself to grieve your failures and celebrate your milestones would be my number one advice.
Oh, thanks for that, Poppy. That's actually really very relevant, I would say, to many people.
Yeah, I think so. It's a long road, and each novel or piece of writing is just a stepping stone in that long road. So you have to sort of keep it in perspective.
So, Poppy, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your books, where can they do that?
I do have a website with beautiful Tasmanian photographs of the wilderness. It's poppyg.com. And I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Are you working on something else at the moment?
I am. And I love it. I'm so excited because I find doing the editing and everything, it's hard work, and there's nothing more fun than sitting down with a blank page. So I am doing something. I'm trying to do it a little bit differently. I want less characters because both of my novels had a lot of characters. So I'm setting the challenge of trying to do something with only 4 or 5 characters.
Yeah, fantastic. So when do you expect it to be out? Any other information about it?
I've just sent my next manuscript off to the agent. So she's reading that right now. That's another psychological mystery set in Tasmania.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm working on now, I'm hoping to finish it. Usually it takes me about 2 years, but I've got small children. But my youngest child starts school in February. So I'm so excited. I feel like I will be able to get so much work done. We'll wait and see. It's my dream to be a 1 book a year author. That's there. I've said it.
Yep, put it out there to the universe, my friend. I love it. Poppy, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you today about this fabulous book. I wish you every success. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be on one of my favourite podcasts talking to you, Claudine. Thank you so much.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.